Hi, I'm Rob Palmatier. I'm one of the co-authors of the book Marketing Strategy, based on first principles in data analytics. What we're going to do in today's session is we're going to go through the very last chapter of the book, chapter 9, and we're really going to talk about implementing marketing principles in data analytics. So let's say you've learned all the market principles. Now we want to talk about implementing those. How can you go implement them? Because it does take some capabilities in order to do this, in order to implement all 4 of these market principles. First, I'm going to do a little introduction, the agenda for today. Just a little bit overview on a little bit of summary of the market principles and why we're doing this. And then I'm going to talk about 2 key aspects of how these fit together, the integration. We're going to look at the temporal interconnections, and we're going to look at micro-macro duality. Then we're going to talk about how to build market capabilities. There's really 2 types of capabilities you need. Data capabilities, collecting the data and storing the data, and methodological capabilities and actually using the data and analyzing to make decisions. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about executing. One is the benefits of using a customer-centric approach. And lastly is that you really need to take an iterative, constantly improving. Do something, you try to do it well, then you move on to the next step, iterate that, and then you circle back and do it again. With that, we'll get started. Kind of an introduction. Overall, marketing has evolved dramatically over the last 6 decades, and now is actually a very key component of many of the Fortune 500 firms, if not all firms. And they're spending billion-dollar budgets. However, over this time, marketing overall has become much more complex. Rather than just saying, here's my product, what am I going to price it, let's go sell it. As you've seen as we went through these, there's a lot more to it, much more sophisticated. What we've tried to do in the market, in the first principles approach, is come up with a framework that makes sense of all the marketing analyses and processes and tools. So rather than just say, here's another way to deal with a marketing problem, and then what happens to a manager, they're faced with a marketing problem, they say, which one of these hundreds of tools do I use? We've tried to put it in a context where what you're trying to do is solve 4 fundamental problems. What are the 4 fundamental problems? All customers differ. That's always going to be a case when you're launching and you're developing a marketing strategy, so you have to know how to manage customer heterogeneity. You know all customers change over time, so you have to manage customer dynamics. You know no matter what you do, competitors are going to come in and attack you, and they're going to react, and as they react, if you're successful, you need to build a barrier around your business to protect your target market and your customers. Finally, all of these decisions record resource allocations and trade-offs. So we want to go through and make those trade-offs effectively. So hopefully this is providing a method to do it. However, if we want to look at how do you build the data and analytical capabilities you need to implement this, because a lot of it is somewhat data intensive, we want to do a little evolution of what's happened over time. First, looking at data availability. If you went into the 70s and 80s, some of the early data was just scanner data or survey data. Scanner data was when grocery stores first put the scanners where they took an item and they scan it over that window rather than look at it and type it into the computer, into the register. That data became available to businesses, so we allowed us to study who was buying different kinds of products, what products were bundled together. That was some of the earliest data. Then CRM data, customer relationship management data, syndicated data where you could buy it by industry. It's like the cell phone companies get together and they provide all their data to one third party. That party pulls all the data together, it removes the names of the people in the companies, and then that data is available. And obviously, internet generates a lot of data. And now in 2010 and beyond, we're getting to mobile data and customer journey data. Mobile data is going to phenomenally change marketing as time goes on, because not only do you need to target what a customer wants, but you want to target it when they want it. If they're walking through a grocery store and we're using mobile data, in the future, potentially it can identify you just bought this product, and they're going to have a little scanner on the cart. You scan your product or you use your phone, and it says, oh, if you bought chips, you ought to buy dip. So later when you're in aisle 3, when you walk by the dip, it'll flash up and say, oh, you want to buy this dip to go with your chips. That's the kind of level it'll be doing. You're walking down a street, it'll give you discount coupons for restaurants in real time. If a restaurant's a little slow right now, they might put a little discount out to bring in 3 or 4 customers. Over the next hour, they start filling up, they remove that discount. That's going to be in real time and based on where you are in geography. Very, very powerful. It's just beginning. Analytical techniques. So not only has data become much more available, let's look at some of the analytic techniques. We talked about cluster analysis, positioning, and choice models. They've been around for a while. Now we're coming out with new techniques such as Bayesian models, CLV analysis, search engine, and mobile targeting. The idea as you're walking by things, they can target you based on where you're at. The last is specific targeting approaches. In the beginning, we did direct mail by zip code. That's as accurate we were in many cases. Now we've got the online targeting and retargeting, micro-targeting based on mass media. Your cable box has the capability to have an individual ad sent to your house. In the future, especially when they get artificial intelligence and such building and machine learning actually building some of the advertisements, they could have individual ads targeted to people in their own house. So there could be 10 families on one street, every family is watching the Super Bowl, and they're all getting different ads. It's going to be very powerful at that point. And also looking more at engagement marketing and geo-targeting. So you can see it's becoming much more complex, and so we need tools to deal with it. And that's why we say market strategy needs 2 building blocks. One building block are these first principles that organizes everything together. The second building block is data analytics. Data analytics really has 2 parts: collecting the data and managing it, and analyzing it. Okay, the next thing I wanted to speak of is 2 types of synergies, or 2 characteristics of this framework that I think are important. One is the idea of temporal interconnectivity or interconnections, and the next is this micro-macro duality. I'm going to go through each one. So a precursor to successfully implementing the strategy is understanding how they work together. With temporal interconnections, where the output of one market principle feeds to the next, as well as the idea of how you're wrestling with this duality. And this duality is this: the idea that many of your decisions, like advertising, has to be made at an aggregate level. If you do a Super Bowl ad, that's a pretty big ad. It's not very targeted. However, customer insights need to be understood at the aggregate level. I've spoken in a couple of these sessions about if I took everybody in this room and I averaged together your desire for a car. Some people wanted a minivan, some wanted a sports car. If I took an average of all of you and say, oh, they want a high-performance minivan. Well, that's not true. That's just the average. Probably if I designed that, neither group would want it because it would not fit them very well. So I need to study things at the individual level to get to the micro insights, but then I ultimately have to make my decisions at a macro level. How much am I going to spend on advertising? So we need to balance those 2 needs: insights at the low level, execution at the macro level. Okay, so first I want to talk about integrating. This is the temporal ordering. So you do market principle 1. All customers differ, so we're going to manage heterogeneity. We're going to do STP analysis, which really involves segmenting the firms, segmenting the industry, picking what target customers I want to go after, and position myself right on top of that target customer. That's going to generate positioning statements. Positioning statements are really the who, what, and when of how I'm going to do my business. I'm going to next look at customer dynamics. We only look at customer dynamics of our own existing customer portfolio. I break them into acquisition, expansion, and retention. Also look at some lost customer. I also look at the CLV of each of these customers and come up with some personas. And the output of that is acquisition, expansion, retention, positioning, and strategies. That's for the whole industry. This is for my own customer portfolio. So it's much more refined. That's more macro. This is more micro. Now, these things both feed into first market principle 3. Market principle 3 is the idea that all competitors are going to react, so I have to build sustainable competitive advantage. I have to manage it. 3 ways of managing it are really around, or the 3 ways I'm going to build it is around BOR, brand, offering, relationship. We talked about it on the equity stack. Once I understand how they fit together, we went through pretty much a session on each topic, on brands, on relationship, on offering, because there's a lot to each of those, but that's where we spend most of our money. What comes out of that? What comes out of that is your BOR marketing strategies. How do you want to use, how does your individual firm want to use brand, offering, and relationships in order to build sustainable competitive advantage today and in the future? That all goes into market principle 4, the idea that all resources are limited and I have to manage resource trade-offs. So how do I manage resource trade-offs? Ideally I use an attribution approach, using response model and experiments. What is the output of this? I get plans and budgets, so I know how I'm going to spend my money. If I have a $100 million marketing budget, this tells me how to do it. Also, out of market principle 3, I get what is going to be my sustainable competitive advantage. How am I going to win now and in the future? So that's the temporal interconnection. You can see there's a natural flow on how you would do this. First the market, then your customer portfolio, then beat off competitors to protect that, and then resource allocation. We also want to talk a little bit more about this micro-macro duality. It identifies insights at the micro but supports macro-level decision-making. It's important because if a firm only averages everything, they're going to miss many deep insights. You need to look at things at a detailed level. So the micro-macro duality is really key to market principle 3. When we came up with the AIR strategy grid, what that came out to from our own customer portfolio, we took into account both customer heterogeneity and customer dynamics, and we came up with personas, and we understood how much money, what was the CLV of each of those personas across acquisition, expansion, and retention. We fed that into our BOR strategy grid, which told us what we wanted to achieve at a macro level. So that AIR grid is at the micro level, the BOR strategy grid is at the macro. So that's really the micro-macro connection occurs when you put those two grids together. Okay, the next thing I wanted to speak of is how to build marketing analytic capabilities, recognizing there's two parts to this, data and analysis capabilities. So first, building overall marketing analytic capabilities, we're going to look at customer analytics. I want to make sure everybody knows what that term means. It's pretty common. Could be defined as a technology-enabled and model-supported approach to harness customer and market data better to understand customers and serve them better. Firms deploy analytics are shown to do better than firms that don't. For example, in 2009, only 10% of the firms regularly employed customer analytics. That number grew to 80% in 2013, with firms spending 21% of their budgets on customer analytics. Also, the software and the market for providing customer analytics software is exploding. Worldwide customer analytics software consists of data warehousing and analytics grew 87% to reach $35 billion in 2012 with a projected growth of almost 10% up to 2017. So you can see this is an expanding area in the marketing space. So talking just about the data capabilities. Data capabilities, by building a database that improves, we got to look at the economic intelligence. That's what's happening in the overall market. Customer, what is our customers doing? And then our competitors, what are our competitors doing? So usually our data warehouse has to capture multiple dimensions. And data specific to these is becoming a lot more available. Some of the data is structured data. That's like numbers, how much sales and all. But there's also a huge amount of unstructured. This is one of the areas in marketing right now that's exploding, is how do you use blog data? Just data on social media, that it's just a bunch of words people are writing and typing about your firm. We're coming up with ways of dealing with that can be quantified in a very quick time frame, almost in real time, so then firms can act on it. For data building methodological capabilities, I'm going to spend a minute on this slide because it captures a couple important points. We went through a lot of different analyses here. But I want to come back to these analyses and make it clear that we're only really doing 3 things with all these analyses. 3 things. The first thing we're doing is we're simplifying data. What do I mean by simplifying data? Very often a CRM database could have thousands of rows, if not millions of rows of data, each one representing customer data. And it could have thousands of columns of data. Each one is a different data element about that customer. If you're trying to have customer insights and make decisions, thousands of columns by thousands, if not millions of rows in some cases, very hard to deal with. Data reduction techniques are ways we collapse those rows and columns into higher level groups that have meaning. Factor analysis is one way to do it for different data elements, because guess what? Maybe 10, 15, 20 of these elements actually are all capturing performance as a higher level factor. So we can group those together. If we have a million rows of customers, Maybe they really only represent 5 to 8 customer segments. I can run cluster analysis and group those customers. So when I get done, rather than having a million rows and thousands of columns, I could have something like 6 columns and 8 rows. And that's my segments and the prime factors that customers use to make decisions. You can obviously see it's going to be much easier to deal with. The next thing we do with data analytics is we link variables to outcomes. We try to understand causality. I do something, how does it drive an outcome? We looked at choice models, whereas when you do something, it actually changes a customer's behavior, like retention, leaving or not leaving. Usually those are all 1-0s kind of outcomes, dichotomous outcomes. We also looked at something like multiple regression, where we have a bunch of input variables driving a continuous outcome variable, like we're just trying to predict sales. Response models is trying to understand causality. Resource optimization is another thing we do. In resource optimization, we do things like conjoint. Conjoint is a way to make an optimal product. We take input from customers across all sorts of what importance there is for different attributes, and it feeds it all into a model and tells us what is the optimal product design to maximize market share or to maximize sales or profits, whatever you want to optimize. We can also use response models here in order to determine the optimum level of advertising spend or the optimum price discount. Customer lifetime value actually can fit in a few, but typically we'd look at it as optimizing decisions. Why? It's converting a lot of numbers to one number. If I want to understand how important a customer is to me so I can know who to treat first, let's say I get I'm an airline and I know when the weather gets bad, I get thousands of incoming phone calls when flights are canceled. I can't answer them all. I just don't have the manpower. I need to prioritize those, and banks do this also. If I know the customer lifetime value of every customer, I might make the customers that are better for me, I earn more money, I may make them wait less in the wait line. Banks do this all the time. When you call in and they have caller ID or they ask for your account number, they send you to the customer, how long you wait and what type of training person you go to. Do you go to a customer service person with lots of training or less? Depends on how much customer lifetime value. It allows you to make more optimal decisions. So these are really the 3 types of decisions we make. So if you look at all these analyses, we're only really trying to do 3 things. Simplify data, understand causality, and selecting optimal resources, resource optimization. Now we're going to go to the last section. The last is executing marketing strategies. There's 2 parts here we want to look at. We want to look at customer-centric approach, and we're going to look at continuous iterating. Let's look at customer-centric first. What is it? Let's define it again. We talked about this earlier, but let's bring it back. It's a company-wide philosophy that places customers' needs at the center of the organization's strategic processes and uses it to make decisions. So the idea is you start with the customer and work back. You don't know what the managers want to do, you do what customers want. Being customer-centric requires a firm to align multiple aspects of its organization. People have looked at leadership, structure, culture, metrics, processes, and strategy. Let's look at a couple of those. Metrics. Enterprise rental car uses Net Promoter Score, and they use that at every level in their organization. They're able to apply an individual Net Promoter Score to an individual person. How is that? Let's say there's 3 people working at the branch at a little car dealer, rental office. Well, those 3 people work, they get allocated all the Net Promoter Scores from everybody who they service that day. Let's say one goes home on break and another person comes. Well, the 2 that are still there gets allocated for the whole time they're working, and the new person picks up. So you can see at any one time there's a running average of your individual Net Promoter Score. Guess what? If you get an individual number that is tied to customers' response to the question, how likely are you to recommend enterprise rental to a friend or colleague, it causes you to act in a certain way. You're trying to solve problems. You're trying to anticipate problems. You're trying to make every customer happy. That's a customer-centric approach. Structure. Structure is the idea that rather than have an organization just selling, at one time IBM was structured by PCs, mini computers, and mainframe computers. There'd be a salesperson going out and all they would do is sell by product, mainframes. They changed a number of years ago and now they're organized by group, by market segment. Financial services, government, education, industry. Now the advantage of that, healthcare, is they have a salesperson going into a financial services company and they say, I'm here from IBM and I'm going to solve your problems. You need a mainframe, I'll solve it. Mini computer, I'll solve it. PCs, I'll solve it. Software solutions, I'll solve it. So now the customer has one person to go to. Once they get going on that, I become an expert in financial services. I become a consultant to them, if you will. You can see how that's much more customer-centric. It allows you to adapt, detect change, and adapt more quickly. It gives you deep knowledge and commitment about your customers and allows you to change to rapid change and adapt to changing market conditions much faster. Last thing is continuously iterating and improving. You could almost say it's a learning approach. The idea is this is way too complex to solve all of this in one big equation, if you will, or at one time. So what you need to do is you need to iterate. An ideal solution would be doing it all at one point. So far, we haven't been able to do that. What we say is you should gradually improve their overall marketing functions by improving one principle at a time. You go out and do market principle 1, you do it really well. Then you probably don't address that again for another couple of years. And you focus on market principle 2, and you do that well. And just about when you're done, you go back and say, I better readdress a market segmentation of the whole industry and say, whoa, it used to be there was one segment here, but that segment's broken into 2 groups. I need 2 separate products if I want to cover both of those groups. That's happened in the last 3 years. So you fix one, you try to do the best you can, you go to the next one, and then you repeat. Or when a problem, if you're tracking metrics like on a dashboard, you might see a problem going in the red, and then you'll change your normal cycle to go fix a problem sometimes. So this concludes this session on Chapter 9, where what we went through is how to implement the first principles. We went through temporally how they're connected. We went through the micro-macro duality that it takes into account. We went to that you have to build both data and analytic capabilities in order to execute market principles. It takes a certain level of sophistication that we see firms are adding as time goes on. And lastly, we see in the implementing probably taking a customer-centric approach and looking at iterating is successful. But that's it. Thank you.